Get your free copy of the complete tutorial at www.teachucomp.com/free.
You can use the pivot table feature of Excel to access some of Excel's most powerful data analysis. Pivot tables let you organize massive amounts of data in more coherent and meaningful ways to extract exactly what you want to know from the data. The ability to reorganize the data in pivot tables to quickly and easily change the information they show is one of their most helpful features. When you create a pivot table, you are comparing data values and then calculating intersecting data values you choose. In addition to pivot tables, you can also create pivot charts, which use the data from pivot tables but show it in a graphic format. The best way to learn how to use a pivot table is to actually create one. The recommended pivot tables in Excel make it easy to create a pivot table by suggesting the type of data you may want to initially view in the pivot table based on the selected data source. You can then choose a recommendation to let Excel automatically create a pivot table that shows the selected data in a new worksheet. You can then edit and change the pivot table just as you would edit a manually created pivot table. Using a recommended pivot table just quickens and simplifies the process of creating a pivot table in Excel. To create a recommended pivot table in Excel, either click to select a cell within an Excel table upon which to base the pivot table to select it as the data source, or click an empty cell in the worksheet to later manually select the pivot table's data source. Then click the Insert tab in the ribbon. Then click the Recommended Pivot Tables button in the Tables button group. If you have already selected a data source by clicking into a worksheet table, then Excel chooses that as the data source and immediately shows the Recommended Pivot Charts dialog box, which we will discuss momentarily. However, if you had previously selected a blank cell in the worksheet, then you must manually select the pivot table's data source in the Choose Data Source dialog box that then appears. Your data source choices are Select a Table or Range, which selects data from your Excel workbook, or Use an External Data Source, which selects data from an existing external data connection in your workbook, network, or on your computer. Select the option button for the choice you prefer. If you select the Select a Table or Range option button, then you can click the Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the table range field to collapse the dialog box down to a single line. Then click and drag over the cell, range, or table to use as the pivot table's data source. Then click the same Collapse Expand dialog box button again to expand the dialog box again after selecting your data. Alternatively, to use a named table as the data source, simply type the table name directly into the table/range field instead of manually selecting its cell range reference. You could also type an absolute cell range reference into the table/range field if desired, instead of manually selecting the cell range. If you select the Use an External Data Source option button, then click the Choose Connection button to open the Existing Connections dialog box. The Existing Connections dialog box shows any available external workbook data connections. You can use the Show drop-down at the top of the dialog box to select the All Connections choice if needed. Doing that then shows all the data connections in your workbook, network, and computer in 3 separate sections of this dialog box. Select the external data connection to use for the pivot table from the connection shown in this dialog box. Then click the Open button to return to the Choose Data Source dialog box. Also, note that while you can select external data tables from the workbook's existing external data connections, like an Access database, as the data source for recommended pivot tables, you cannot select external Excel tables you have added to the workbook's data model when creating recommended pivot tables unless you first use the Import To dialog box to load the external Excel table into a worksheet in the current workbook. In that case, you can then click into the copy of the external table loaded into the current workbook, and then create the recommended pivot table as you would with a native Excel table. Alternatively, if you don't want to load the connected external Excel table into the current workbook, you can instead use external Excel tables you have added to the workbook's data model as a PivotTables data source by manually creating the pivot table by using the Pivot Table button instead of the recommended Pivot Tables button. We will cover manually creating pivot tables in Excel in the next lesson. After selecting a data source, click the OK button to continue. After selecting a data source, Excel then opens the Recommended Pivot Tables dialog box. The left side of this dialog box displays several different types of default data analysis for the pivot table. Select the type of pivot table to create from this listing. A large preview of the selected pivot table then appears in the area to the right. Then click the OK button at the bottom of this dialog box to create the selected pivot table. Also, note that if your data selection did not include enough data fields or contained too many blank or repetitive cell entries, you may not be able to create a recommended pivot table. If this is the case, Excel informs you of that fact within this dialog box. However, you can still click the OK button to continue and insert a blank pivot table into a new workbook. You must then manually add the data to show within the pivot table by using the PivotTable Fields task pane that then appears. After creating a pivot table, the PivotTable Fields task pane appears at the right side of your workbook window. In the PivotTable Fields pane, the information from your selected data source appears. Note the fields that have been added to your pivot table and into which quadrant at the bottom of the pane those fields have been placed. These settings determine the values that appear within your pivot table. You can change the values displayed within the pivot table by using the PivotTable Fields task pane. You can check the checkbox next to each field in the Choose Fields to Add to Report section that you want to add to the pivot table. If you check a field, Excel then adds it into one of the quadrants in the Drag Fields Between Areas Below section at the bottom of the task pane. For pivot tables, these quadrants are filters, columns, rows, and values. At that point, you can then click and drag the fields from one quadrant to another based on what function or layout you want the pivot table to show. The data values of the fields placed into the Values quadrant are calculated using the sum function by default.
Like what you see? Pick up your free copy of the complete tutorial at www.teachucomp.com/free.